Americans are divided on their love-hate relationship with Pope Francis, but the question is, why? Here to answer that question from the Eternal City, Church Militant's Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, Pope Francis visited the United States back in 2015, but on occasion has bashed America and Americans, especially, his critics, such as last month when he said some Americans harbor, quote, a very strong, organized, reactionary attitude, end quote. Now a recent poll is saying Americans are almost perfectly divided in their take on Pope Francis. Tell us about this poll and what it found.
Brad, the poll was published on the weekend. It was an Economist YouGov poll. And what it found is quite shocking. It found that Pope Francis is a massively polarizing figure. I mean, almost as polarizing as Donald Trump, one might say. So let's give you a couple of stats from the poll. For example, 12% of U.S. adults have a very favorable view of Pope Francis, while another 12% have a very negative opinion of the pontiff. Then a larger percentage, about 31%, have a somewhat favorable opinion of Francis, and 14% have a somewhat unfavorable assessment of him. It also found that 40% of Republicans say he's very liberal or liberal, and 57% of liberals, on the other hand, love him to bits. That's how polarizing Pope Francis gets, Brad.
Well, just taking that last bit of information for a moment, Jules, 40% of Republicans who would class themselves as conservative, not liberal, they see Pope Francis as liberal or very liberal. Then the 57% of those self-proclaimed liberals on the left actually would agree. They would say he is liberal. So both sides, basically a good amount of both sides, right and left, are in agreement that the Pope is liberal. But why is that? What policies, what papal policies are they viewing and coming to that same conclusion?
Pope Francis, as we know, has been the champion of some of the most hated globalist leftist policies that have been put forward across the world in the last 4 or 5 years. So, for example, he is a champion of the whole green agenda. He was very much in favor of things like the lockdown. He was pushing a certain therapy a couple of years ago, if we remember. He's also soft on homosexuality. And other things liberals love him for. He's constantly attacked Donald Trump as a populist. He's gone after people like Bolsonaro and, of course, the president of Hungary, Viktor Orban. So these are things that really endear Pope Francis to liberals.
Yeah, also he has the open borders. I mean, there was no border that shouldn't be more open, and yet they have a wall around the Vatican City State. Why else would liberal Americans, kind of think in the area of sexual ethics here in particular, like Francis?
One thing that has been very clear is he's not just open and explicit support for the, homosexualist Father James Martin, the Jesuit who never stopped pushing the LGBT agenda, but also for his female counterpart, Sister Janine Gramick, a nun who was banned by the Vatican and now reinstated, rehabilitated, and given full honors by Pope Francis. So Pope Francis is seen as, virtually opening the door to same-sex civil unions. Obviously, in Argentina, he said there's nothing wrong with that. But he's also repeatedly welcomed homosexuals, transgender people to the Vatican. He's declared, as we already said, he's handwritten letters to Father James Martin a number of times. So when the New York Times and the Washington Post sing his praises, they are very conscious of his, shall we say, open sexual agenda.
Well, we don't want to get hung up on sins below the waist, Jules, right? So why would GOP Catholics who, would see themselves as Republican, why would they in particular in the United States actually not like Pope Francis?
Very obviously because of his support of President Joe Biden and Speaker Nancy Pelosi, both claiming to be faithful Catholics, committed Catholics, and yet both committed openly to, very brutal policies on abortion. The other factor, of course, is his constant marginalization of faithful American bishops like Joseph Strickland, and we all know he hates Cardinal Burke. And then there has been this promotion of tainted bishops like Zanchetta, etc., and of course the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass, Traditiones Custodes, suffocating the Tridentine Mass has been, the worst punishment he's imposed on faithful and conservative Catholics in the United States. Because, of course, as we know, the traditional movement is thriving. If of all parts of the world, it's the United States that's the hub of the Latin Mass.
So now let's narrow it down to another group of Catholics. Why would some media-minded Catholics, or Catholics maybe in the media, social media and elsewhere, actually not like Pope Francis?
One thing that the media has repeatedly covered is Francis's hits on conservatives, particularly those who are, contributing to the discourse in the media. He calls them backwardists. Indietrismo is the word he's used in Italian. He's dismissed them as rigid ideologues. He said that they are not committed to the Catholic faith, to authentic Catholic doctrine. They don't understand the evolution or the development of doctrine. Instead, they are committed to an ideology, pre-Vatican II ideology that is constantly looking backward instead of going with the times. By the way, he's also insulted the media, calling them, calling people who are reporting on the Vatican and exposing the corruption as people who have a pathological obsession for excreta, coprophilia is the term he has used.
Yeah, he also looks at him as a very strong, organized, reactionary attitude, he says they have in circles there. Well, the poll also showed that nearly one-third of Americans, nearly one-third, 31%, when asked about Pope Francis, their take on him, said they don't know whether they hold a favorable or unfavorable view of the current papacy. And to that, I'd say maybe they need to tune into Rome Dispatch and stop being low information Americans. Jules, thank you so much for parsing the story today and such a spot-on analysis on the story that hits so close to home.
Thank you, Brad.